I still remember the smell of scorched earth, the smoke rising on the horizon, and the weight of that flag in my hands. I'll never forget how the fabric felt, like the only thing I had left, as if that damn flag was the only connection to something bigger than me, bigger than what had happened there in that devastated field on that senseless day. My name is Sarah Calloway. I was a war veteran, and the world knows me as someone who did her duty. But no one ever knew what really happened in that field, in that moment when everything was lost, and I decided to protect the last American flag, still standing. Was a child from a simple family with simple dreams, and for a long time, the idea of war was distant, like something you see on the news and think, that happens to other people. I never thought I'd be the one to carry that burden, to live those endless days. I never imagined I'd be the last one to see the flag waving, and the last one with the courage to save something that represented everything I hated and loved at the same time. I remember how the world around me was falling apart, the sounds of bombs and gunfire, and me, standing there, having to choose between continuing the fight or giving up. But I looked at that flag, and something told me, if not you, who else? There was no glory that day, only the certainty that by making that decision, I was burying myself along with it. The mission was lost, the unit was broken, but the flag was still there, standing, almost mocking our defeat. It was as if, seeing it intact, I had a chance to redeem everything that was happening, or at least try. I knew that by protecting that symbol, I was sacrificing myself in a way I didn't even understand. And when I finally managed to bring it back, the price I paid was more than my youth. I lost my peace. Back home, in my country, in the arms of a family that didn't understand what I'd left behind, no one ever asked what happened after that flag was saved. They wanted the hero, the victory, the easy answer. But what I brought back was the weight of a memory no one else could carry. What I saw there, what I lived through, what I sacrificed, stayed with me in a capsule I learned to hide behind a smile and words that kept me moving forward. But what no one knew, what I hid from everyone for years, was that that flag, the last flag I protected, was the only thing that still made me believe that after everything, I hadn't lost completely. I lived my life as if each day was a repetition of the one before. Not because there was nothing left to live for, but because, in a way, my soul was exhausted. The war left me with scars I didn't know how to explain. I smiled when asked, worked without questioning, helped my family with whatever was needed. But all of it was like a cloak I wore to cover what was inside me, a restlessness, a pain that no matter how hard I tried, I couldn't bury. The flag was stored away, but not the weight it carried. And as everyone knows, it's much harder to live with what's hidden than with what's out in the open. The truth is, no one knew who I was or what I carried. I was the silent veteran, the one who only talked about work and routine. At those family gatherings, where everyone was caught up in their own dramas and stories, no one asked how I was really doing. Sometimes I felt like everyone around me was so wrapped up in their own lives that my pain, my internal struggle, was invisible, and I preferred it that way. After all, who could understand? Who could comprehend what it's like to carry a symbol of something so grand and, at the same time, so devastating? But then, something changed. I was walking through the city, as I did every afternoon, when I was approached by a young veteran. His eyes were full of questions, and the way he looked at me made me feel like he saw more than the simple uniform I'd once worn. He wanted to know about the war. He wanted to know how to survive, how to deal with the scars that become part of who we are. I was reluctant at first, but there was something in his eyes that made me feel I couldn't hide anymore. I knew he didn't yet understand what war really does to someone, and suddenly I found myself talking, Not about the last flag, but about everything I lost to protect it. That conversation, which started as a simple chat between two veterans, became the first time in years that I began to look at myself without the filters of survival. I talked about the battles, the pain, the shame of losing so much without understanding why. I talked about how that flag, the symbol of my country, was the only thing that kept me going, even when everything was collapsing around me. When I finished, I saw the young veteran's eyes widen. He asked me to share my story with others, to help those going through what I had. He wanted me to speak, to be an example. But I hesitated. I didn't want to be the heroine or the savior. I just wanted to be Sarah. But seeing him so determined, I realized he needed something I'd stopped looking for: understanding. And then, without further words, he handed me a card with his number saying, "War isn't a burden we should carry alone. If you need to talk, I'll be here." I didn't know what to expect, but I felt something I hadn't felt in a long time. The sense that maybe I wasn't invisible. Maybe, just maybe, someone could truly understand what I carried inside me. In the days that followed, the card stayed in my purse. I ran my fingers over it from time to time, feeling its texture as if it were an anchor, but I never had the courage to call. The fear of opening another wound, of bringing up everything I'd buried, stopped me from taking that step. I'd already convinced myself that the solitude of my pain was safer. But what I didn't realize at the time was that by keeping everything locked inside, I was perpetuating the war I'd left behind. It wasn't the external fight with enemies. It was the internal battle against memories, scars that never heal, and the denial of what had really happened. A week later, when the afternoon was calm and the sound of cars was just a distant murmur, I finally decided to call. My body was tense, but as the phone rang, I realized there was no turning back. When he answered, his voice was calm, almost gentle, as if he already knew the silence inside me needed to be broken. And then I started talking. Not about the last flag, not right away. I talked about the fear, about the nights when the screams of my comrades still echoed in my ears, about the longing for those left behind. I talked about the weight of a sacrifice that was never asked of me, but that I accepted as if it were my choice. He listened. He didn't interrupt. He didn't offer advice. He just listened, as if the words I'd kept bottled up for so long were the same ones he needed to hear from someone else. And it was there, in that simple conversation, that I understood the real fight was no longer on the battlefield, but in the field of memory. I wasn't fighting to save a flag anymore. I was fighting to save myself. The young veteran, who I now considered more a friend than a stranger, asked me to share my story at a veterans meeting he organized. I hesitated. For a moment, the fear returned, fear of judgment, of being seen as the woman still carrying the burdens of a time long gone. But when he spoke about how courage can inspire others to deal with their own pain, I knew this wasn't just an opportunity for me. It was a chance to turn the weight of the past into something that could help others not get lost, as I had for so long. That night, after talking with him, I made a decision that would change everything. I was going to speak, not to be admired, not to be a heroine, but to free myself from the prison I'd built around my story. I went to the meeting place, my legs trembling, my heart racing, but determined not to turn back. And when I arrived, I felt the weight of a room full of eyes, but also the lightness of finally being able to breathe. I didn't know what I was going to say, but I knew the words would find their way. The room was fuller than I'd imagined. Veterans of all ages with stories in their eyes, some already bearing the marks of time on their faces, others still with the youth trying to hide. Behind masks of courage, I sat at the front, my heart pounding, my hands cold. The young veteran, who had convinced me to be there, gave me an encouraging smile, but his expression betrayed concern. I knew he was nervous too, but not for himself. He wanted me to be strong. He wanted me to find my voice. When they asked me to speak, the sound of my voice surprised even me. It wasn't trembling, it wasn't fear. It was simply the sound of truth, a truth I didn't know how to carry alone. "I'm Sarah Calloway," I began, feeling the weight of the name, but not losing myself in it. I was a war veteran, and for many years, I carried the weight of a decision I made during the conflict. I was the last one to protect the flag when everything seemed lost. The room fell silent, eyes turned to me, but the silence wasn't threatening. It was a silence of understanding. I opened the wound little by little, without haste, without trying to quickly heal what was still painful. I talked about the battle where I found myself alone, with everyone around me falling and the flag still waving, a symbol of what remained. I talked about the pain of making that choice, not out of courage, but out of a need to save something, even if I was lost myself. And the most painful part of all, I brought it back, but I didn't know what to do with it. I didn't know what to do with what it represented. I stored it away, and with it I stored my scars. When I finished, there was no applause. There was no need. The words were there, exposed, like a weight shared by everyone. Some eyes were teary, others reflected a silent understanding, but all were present in the moment. The young veteran approached, me at the end, his hand extended. "I knew you had a story, but I didn't know how important it would be." I looked at him speechless and felt something I hadn't felt in a long time. Not shame, but relief. I had finally shared the weight I'd carried for so long, but more importantly, what happened in the days that followed. The group of veterans began to share their own stories. They weren't just accounts of victories and defeats in war. They were stories of lost families, broken hearts, choices that had to be made, not out of courage, but for survival. They talked about the weight of carrying a symbol that no longer made sense, about the loneliness of coming home and not being recognized by others or themselves. And as I listened to these stories, I realized that in some way, we were all carrying the same flag, not the flag of the nation, but the flag of suffering and overcoming. Over the weeks, I realized that the act of talking about the war, about the flag, about the pain I'd hidden for so long, was turning into something more than a shared story. It was becoming the key to understanding that while the traumas of war are solitary, healing doesn't have to be. Each of us in those meetings brought a piece of the same story, a piece that, when shared, not only healed itself, but helped heal the next person. The collective pain became a force for healing, stronger than any individual suffering. I started attending more meetings, listening to other veterans, understanding that there was much more between us than just a distant past. Over time, I began helping organize the sessions, listening to others' stories, offering a shoulder, or simply a safe space for them to speak. I was no longer carrying just the weight of the last flag. Now I was helping lift the flags of other veterans who, like me, needed their stories to be heard. At one of these meetings, an older veteran approached me at the end. He had a tired look, like someone who had been through many battles, but his gesture was one of pure humility. "You made me remember something I left behind," he said, his voice hoarse. "It's not the last flag that defines who we are. It's what we do with what we learned after the war." I was lost until I heard you speak. I didn't know I could feel this again. He shook my hand and walked away, but he left something with me, a feeling that I was no longer alone in that fight. And that feeling stayed with me for days. At home, I began to see my family differently. They never fully understood the war, what I had lived through, but they were starting to realize that my pain wasn't a choice, but something that, in some way, shaped who I am. Slowly, conversations became more open. I no longer needed to hide the story I carried. Not because the burden was lighter, but because I finally understood that no one else needed to carry it alone. The young veteran who had encouraged me to speak had now become a close friend, and his presence gave me strength to keep sharing my story with more and more people. But at the same time, the shadows of war never completely disappeared. I saw how recovery is a slow and ongoing process, and that with each new step, each new conversation, there was a part of me that still needed healing. And it was at that moment that I realized that while my mission to protect the last flag had defined me for so long, there was a new mission I had now: to help others find their own flags and learn to carry them. Time passed faster than I expected. Those meetings, which initially seemed like a space for confrontation, became my anchor. I started to see that true recovery wasn't about forgetting what happened, but about accepting it, sharing the weight of the experience. Each veteran who approached me, each story I helped tell, became a part of my own healing. I was no longer alone, and more importantly, I began to realize that there was a purpose in my suffering, a purpose that was being revealed with each step. One chilly autumn afternoon, during one of these meetings, the group was discussing the importance of symbols, flags, the things that anchor us. That's when a younger veteran who had lost a friend in the war looked at me and asked, "What does the last flag mean to you, Sarah? Why did you protect it back then?" I thought for a moment, and then with a calm voice, I said, "The flag was all that was left. It was a symbol of resistance, of everything we fought to preserve. But now, I see that the real meaning isn't in protecting it, but in sharing what it represents. It's not the symbol that defines us anymore. It's the actions we take after everything we've been through." The words hung in the air, heavier than I'd imagined. That's when I realized I was ready to truly leave the past where it belonged. Not as an open wound, but as a part of my story that now served something greater than myself. I didn't need the last flag to define me anymore. I was already defined by the choices I made, the lives we touched along the journey, and the love I began to rediscover in the connections I made with other veterans. The flag, which once represented only sacrifice, now symbolized redemption and transformation. I knew that as more veterans joined the group and shared their own stories, the more we understood each other. But more than that, we began to understand the importance of helping each other carry the burden so no one had to do it alone. When I finished speaking, everyone in the room was silent, but I knew that in that silence, there was more healing than any spoken word. True healing doesn't happen overnight. I knew that now. After so many years, so many hidden wounds, I finally began to realize that the journey that started with protecting the last flag wasn't about what I did on that battlefield, but about what I could still do with the time I had left. The hardest battle wasn't won with bravery, but with patience, with the slow steps we take to restore what seemed irreparable. The change I began to feel in myself also affected those around me. My family, who had once been distanced by my silent pain, started to approach me in a new way, no longer with the concern of fixing what I felt, but with a desire to walk beside me, to understand my story without rushing to forget the past. The bond we had deepened, and I was finally able to talk to them about the struggles I still faced, without fear of being judged or misunderstood. They couldn't erase what I'd lived through, but they were willing to help build a new version of myself. It was during this process of rediscovery that I began to realize that what I did in the war, the choice to protect that flag, had only been the beginning of something much bigger. I was in a much more intimate battlefield now, fighting to reconcile what the war had taken from me and what I could give to others. The flag was no longer a symbol of sacrifice. It became a symbol of resilience, of rebuilding. And then, during one of those meetings where we talked about the challenges of living after war, a younger veteran who was just beginning to understand the weight he carried, approached me. He said, "I never knew how to share this, how to tell my story without seeming weak. You helped me see that there's no shame in being vulnerable, in asking for help." And it was in that moment that I realized the true impact of what we started. It wasn't about saving the last flag, but about saving the lives that were still at risk, the lives of those who, like me, were trying to find their way back. I was no longer the woman who had protected a flag. I was the woman who helped others recover what had been lost within themselves. The cycle that began with an act of courage turned into a mission of healing. And now, more than ever, I knew that the meaning of that last flag was something no one could take from me. The choice to leave no one behind, to carry the burden together with others, and, most importantly, to live life looking forward, not back. The following days were filled with encounters, both unexpected and necessary. I became, without intending to, a sort of guide for other veterans, more for my experience in learning to live with what was left behind than for any wisdom they thought I had. Each of us carried a different story, but the pain and scars were the same. I began to see the real impact of sharing my own journey, not to show off, but to show that pain doesn't have to be a solitary burden. I spoke to help, but what I didn't know was that I was also helping myself find a piece of myself I'd lost along the way. The group that once seemed disconnected now shared a strength I never imagined possible. We began to meet not just to talk, but to do something with our experiences. We organized events to share our stories with younger generations, participated in ceremonies honoring veterans, and started volunteering in hospitals and support centers for veterans. What began as a personal need to find someone who understood me became something collective, something bigger than any of us could have achieved alone. The last flag I had protected began to symbolize more than a war. It became the symbol of a community coming together to heal what was broken. And then, at one of these events, as I stood beside other veterans, something in me unraveled. It wasn't weakness, but a release. I looked at the faces of everyone there and knew that the weight I carried no longer defined me. The past was there, but it no longer controlled what I did or who I was. The symbol of the flag now represented a future where none of us would be alone. And it was in that moment with teary eyes that I realized the greatest act of courage wasn't protecting a flag, but letting it go and living what came next with dignity and, above all, with the support of those who truly understood. But not everything was easy. As the tension grew, so did opposing voices. Some people in my family, especially those who wouldn't understand a veteran's internal conflicts, began to distance themselves. It wasn't resentment, but a silent discomfort. The war, for them, was a distant chapter, and I was reopening, a wound they preferred to keep closed. But at the same time, I realized their distance was no longer a threat. I didn't need their approval to live my truth. What I was doing, helping other veterans heal, was more important than any judgment. Over time, my story, the last flag, and the other veterans became part of something even bigger. It was no longer just the memory of a lost battle. It was now part of a generation that, though marked by pain, knew that the true victory was in finding the strength to live and move forward. I saw myself no longer as the woman who needed to save something, but as the woman who could help others save themselves. The final act of courage wasn't a grand feat. It wasn't a battle fought in a distant field, but the decision to accept the pain of the past and finally look to the future. Slowly, I began to understand that true recovery wasn't about keeping the flag stored as a symbol of what I'd lost, but about setting it free, setting myself free. And the way I did that was by sharing my story, helping others deal with their own scars, and most importantly, teaching us all that the true meaning of a flag isn't what it represents materially, but what it symbolizes in the heart of those who see it. When I handed the last flag to the Veterans Memorial, I knew I wasn't just saying goodbye to a symbol, but to the need to keep being defined by a single act of bravery. The courage was now in my smile, in the way I looked at others with a new perspective, and in how I accepted that my life, even with all its losses, could still be a story of redemption. What freed me wasn't a heroic gesture, but the understanding that healing lies in giving and receiving. By being part of others' lives, I also became part of my own healing. At that ceremony, I felt I could finally rest, not because I was the last one to protect the flag, but because I knew the legacy of my courage wasn't in the memory of an isolated act, but in the life I chose to live afterward. Now, as I look at the veterans around me, listen to their stories, and share my own, I realize that while the war took so much from us, it also gave us the opportunity to transform our pain into strength. And that, in itself, is a victory no one can ever take from us. And with that, I moved forward. Life continued, and with it, the lesson that it's never too late to find what truly matters. The peace that comes from within, the ability to heal, and above all, the opportunity to teach others to live with courage, not for what they lost, but for what they can still achieve.